It was a quiet Wednesday morning in a small suburban town. Jamal Parker, a young 18-year-old black man, was on his way to work at a local grocery store. He was a hard-working, determined young man, looking forward to finishing high school and beginning a career in computer programming. His mom had always taught him to stay out of trouble and work hard, and he followed those lessons every day. As he walked down the street, wearing a hoodie and headphones, he didn't notice the patrol car that had been following him for several blocks. It was just another normal day in his life, or so I thought. Without warning, two uniformed officers pulled up beside him. Before Jamal could react, they grabbed him, pushing him roughly against a nearby fence. His heart raced as the officers accused him of a robbery that had taken place earlier in the day. The officers didn't give him a chance to explain. They didn't listen to his protests as they handcuffed him, saying he fit the description of the suspect. His mind spun as they shoved him into the back of their patrol car. Jamal's phone slipped from his pocket, and the world outside seemed to blur. He felt the weight of injustice hanging over him. He couldn't believe this was happening. How could they just accuse him without any proof? The courtroom was filled with tense energy as Jamal stood at the defense table, his hands still shaking from the events that had unfolded. The walls were lined with spectators and reporters who had caught wind of the case. News of a young black man being falsely accused was making headlines, and the tension in the air was palpable. Jamal's attorney, Sarah Williams, was standing by his side, trying to keep him calm, but even she knew this would be an uphill battle. The prosecutor stood confidently, describing how Jamal was caught by the officers in a neighborhood close to where a robbery had just occurred. His hoodie, the prosecutor claimed, matched the description of the suspect, and the officers had acted on instinct. Jamal tried his best to sit still, his eyes nervously darting around the courtroom. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. What was supposed to be a simple trial to clear his name was slowly becoming a nightmare. He glanced at his mother sitting in the back row, her face filled with worry. This wasn't supposed to be his reality. He had never broken the law. He had always tried to stay on the right path. As the prosecutor laid out the case, Jamal's mind raced. How had they gotten it so wrong? The officers had no real evidence against him. It was just a case of mistaken identity, but it felt like the system was already set against him. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened with a loud creak and everyone turned toward the entrance. The courtroom was filled with tense energy as Jamal stood at the defense table, his hands still shaking from the events that had unfolded. The walls were lined with spectators and reporters who had caught wind of the case. News of a young black man being falsely accused was making headlines, and the tension in the air was palpable. Jamal's attorney, Sarah Williams, was standing by his side, trying to keep him calm, but even she knew this would be an uphill battle. The prosecutor stood confidently, describing how Jamal was caught by the officers in a neighborhood close to where a robbery had just occurred. His hoodie, the prosecutor claimed, matched the description of the suspect, and the officers had acted on instinct. Jamal tried his best to sit still, his eyes nervously darting around the courtroom. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. What was supposed to be a simple trial to clear his name was slowly becoming a nightmare. He glanced at his mother sitting in the back row, her face filled with worry. This wasn't supposed to be his reality. He had never broken the law. He had always tried to stay on the right path. As the prosecutor laid out the case, Jamal's mind raced. How had they gotten it so wrong? The officers had no real evidence against him. It was just a case of mistaken identity, but it felt like the system was already set against him. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened with a loud creak, and everyone turned toward the entrance. The courtroom grew quiet as a tall, well-dressed woman entered, her confident stride, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her sharp black suit contrasted with her calm demeanor, and as her heels clicked against the floor, the room seemed to hold its breath. She wasn't on the list of witnesses, and no one had expected her. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. She moved toward the back of the courtroom and made a subtle nod toward Jamal's defense attorney, Sarah. Without saying a word, she took her place in the back row, seemingly blending into the shadows. But there was something about her presence that stood out. Her eyes never left the prosecutor as he continued to speak, and there was an air of authority around her that made everyone uneasy. As the trial went on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this woman was important, somehow connected to the case, even if no one knew how. She had a professional poise that said she wasn't just an ordinary bystander. Her presence felt like it carried a weight much heavier than a spectator. Who was she? And why was she here? Jamal couldn't take his eyes off her either. He was too caught up in the uncertainty of what was happening around him. The prosecutor's words blurred together as he tried to figure out why this woman had walked into the room at that moment. But as the trial proceeded, he felt like something was about to shift. Something unexpected. The woman remained silent in the back of the courtroom as the trial continued, but Sarah could not shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had seen enough trials in her career to know when a case was about to take an unexpected turn. The woman's presence felt almost like a warning, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. Suddenly, the prosecutor paused mid-sentence and turned toward the judge, looking flustered. The room grew eerily quiet as the judge called for a recess. A ripple of confusion ran through the courtroom. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening. The courtroom doors opened, and Sarah noticed the woman stand up from her seat. With a composed demeanor, the woman walked briskly toward the front, and as she passed Sarah, she offered a slight nod. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her approach. He had no idea who she was, but there was something about her that filled him with a strange sense of hope. "Your Honor," the woman began as she reached the front of the courtroom. "I have something to show." She flashed a badge. A CIA badge. The room fell silent, and every eye in the courtroom turned toward her in shock. "I'm Agent Rebecca Hayes," she continued, her voice firm but calm, "and I have information that will exonerate the defendant." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. A CIA agent? How did she fit into this case? The prosecutor's face drained of color as he quickly adjusted his glasses, his confidence cracking. Sarah looked at the agent, her mind racing, trying to understand what this revelation meant for Jamal's case. Agent Rebecca Hayes stood confidently in front of the judge, her eyes scanning the courtroom as the weight of her revelation sunk in. The judge, clearly taken aback, motioned for the prosecutor to step aside. There was no denying the significance of the badge she had flashed. A CIA agent in a courtroom for a case like this? It didn't make sense. "Agent Hayes, can you explain why you're involved in this case?" the judge asked, his voice steady, though there was a note of uncertainty. The agent nodded, her face impassive. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here to correct a misunderstanding. The young man standing before you, Jamal Parker, was not involved in the robbery the police accused him of. I have evidence that proves he was in a different location at the time the crime took place." The prosecutor's face contorted in disbelief. "What evidence could you possibly have, Agent Hayes? This is a simple case of mistaken identity." Agent Hayes glanced at Jamal for a brief moment before she spoke again. "We intercepted the security footage from the area where the robbery occurred. Jamal was clearly not in that vicinity. In fact, he was elsewhere, working at the grocery store as he has been for months. His alibi checks out, and I've personally verified the timeline." A wave of relief swept over Jamal. For the first time since the arrest, he felt a sense of clarity. The truth was finally coming to light. As the courtroom absorbed this new information, the prosecutor seemed to shrink under the weight of the unexpected turn of events. The defense attorney, Sarah, turned to Jamal with a reassuring smile. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time today, Jamal allowed himself to believe that justice was within reach. Agent Hayes moved smoothly, pulling a manila folder from her briefcase and placing it on the judge's desk. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the shock that rippled through the courtroom. She turned to face the room again, her eyes never leaving the prosecutor. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone was waiting for the next revelation. "Your Honor," she began, "I've brought with me the original footage of the robbery, along with detailed surveillance data that clearly shows Jamal was nowhere near the scene. His alibi is solid. I have already spoken with the manager at the grocery store where he works. Jamal was there the entire time, fulfilling his shift." A murmur of disbelief swept across the room. The prosecutor, now visibly rattled, adjusted his glasses once more and leaned toward the judge. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is irrelevant. The defendant was identified by 2 police officers as the suspect." Agent Hayes held up her hand to silence him, her voice unwavering. "I'm not finished yet. I also have information regarding a key detail in the officer's report. The suspect in the robbery was wearing a red hoodie. Jamal was wearing a blue one that day, an obvious detail the officers overlooked. The prosecutor's face flushed red with frustration. It was clear the ground beneath his argument was crumbling. The courtroom was silent as the judge examined the folder in front of him. The defense attorney, Sarah, exchanged a glance with Jamal, her expression full of quiet hope. "I trust this evidence is enough to prove my client's innocence?" Sarah asked, turning to the judge. The judge nodded slowly, his mind clearly processing the bombshell that had just dropped. Jamal's heart raced as he began to realize that he was on the verge of freedom. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had started as a tense trial, filled with accusations and uncertainty, now felt like the turning of a tide. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, was now on the defensive. His earlier confident demeanor had faltered, and his face was flushed with frustration. He rose from his seat, his voice sharp and strained as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I must request a moment to review the evidence. This is unprecedented. The CIA, this is not normal procedure for a simple criminal case." Agent Hayes remained composed, her posture still poised as she stood across from him. "With all due respect, sir, the evidence is clear. I have no intention of undermining the judicial process, but I must ensure that the truth is heard. I would strongly recommend we move forward with this correction before an innocent life is wrongfully destroyed." The prosecutor's hand clenched into a fist at his side as he looked toward the judge, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. The audience seemed to hold their breath as the judge examined the evidence carefully. He seemed to sense the weight of the moment. The decision he made would change the course of this trial, but he had to make sure it was done right. "All right," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We will recess for 15 minutes. During that time, I expect the prosecution to fully examine this new evidence. Agent Hayes, please remain available should we need further clarification." As the courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter, Jamal felt an unfamiliar sense of hope begin to swell within him. Could this really be happening? Could he truly be freed from this nightmare? The recess was brief but felt like an eternity for Jamal. He sat quietly, his mind racing as he absorbed the magnitude of what had just transpired. The evidence, the unexpected appearance of Agent Hayes, and the overwhelming support from his attorney were all things Jamal never could have imagined when he was first arrested. Now, as he sat in that courtroom, it felt like the weight of the world was lifting off his shoulders. He could hear murmurs of excitement and disbelief around him as the judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of the recess. Everyone returned to their seats, and the judge, with a firm expression, signaled for the trial to resume. Jamal's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. Agent Hayes stood up once more, her demeanor as calm as ever. The prosecutor, now visibly defeated, remained seated, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Sarah, Jamal's attorney, leaned toward him and whispered, "This is it, Jamal. I think we're going to win this." The judge looked over at the prosecutor one last time. "Do you have any objections to the evidence presented by Agent Hayes?" he asked, his voice firm. The prosecutor hesitated for a moment, his confidence completely gone. He glanced at Agent Hayes, then at the evidence, and shook his head. "No, Your Honor, no further objections." The judge nodded, turning to Jamal. "Mr. Parker, after careful review of the evidence and the statements provided, I am satisfied that there is no basis for the charges against you. You are free to go." Jamal could hardly believe the words he was hearing. It was over. He was free. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the judge's words sank in. Jamal stood frozen for a moment, unable to process the reality of his newfound freedom. He had been fighting for his innocence for what felt like an eternity, and now it was finally official. His body shook with a mix of relief, disbelief, and gratitude. The prosecutor, clearly beaten, stood silently beside the judge's bench, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The weight of his defeat hung heavily in the air. Jamal turned toward his defense attorney, Sarah, whose face lit up with a wide smile. "You did it, Jamal," she said quietly, her voice full of pride. "The truth won out. You're free." Jamal's eyes welled with tears, but he forced them back. He couldn't show weakness, not here, not now. He had been through too much to let emotion take over. He turned to look at his mother, who was sitting in the back row of the courtroom. Her face was filled with relief, and she quickly stood up, rushing toward him with open arms. Jamal didn't hesitate. He walked toward her, and as they embraced, all the frustration, fear, and anxiety he had been carrying for weeks seemed to melt away. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for his family, his friends, and everyone who had supported him through this trial. As they stepped out of the courtroom into the bright sunlight, Jamal's mind raced. He was free, but the world still felt heavy with questions. How had this happened? What would happen now? One thing was certain. He would never forget the day his life had changed forever. The days following the trial were filled with media attention and mixed emotions. Jamal's story spread like wildfire across social media. News outlets covered the shocking twist in his case, and soon, his name was everywhere. People praised the unexpected intervention of Agent Hayes, and Jamal found himself at the center of a growing narrative about justice and the abuse of power. Some saw him as a hero for standing up against a system that had wronged him, while others speculated about the mysterious CIA agent who had stepped in at the last moment. But even with all the attention, Jamal knew this was only the beginning. The world around him seemed to be waking up to the flaws in the justice system, but he also felt a creeping uncertainty. Agent Hayes' words kept echoing in his mind. It's bigger than one mistaken identity. What did that mean? Who else was involved? And who else was? Why had this happened to him in the first place? As Jamal navigated the media frenzy, he tried to focus on the future. His immediate relief at being cleared of charges had started to give way to a new reality, one where his story could be part of something much larger. He knew now that people were paying attention, and he had a platform he'd never asked for. But what would he do with it? In the coming weeks, Jamal made a decision. He reached out to Agent Hayes, using the number she had given him. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he had to understand the bigger picture. There was more to this story, and Jamal was ready to uncover it. With determination in his heart, Jamal took the first step toward a new chapter in his life, not just as a man who had been wronged, but as someone who could now help change the system. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew he would never stop fighting for the truth.